Just a heads up before the video starts, this is mostly going to be me talking over some pictures. Feel free just to listen along with this in the background. As always, thanks for watching. Well, I'm back. It's been about a year since I seriously painted anything. Last year my first kid was born and well, there went all of my free time. I'm finally starting to get back into a place where I have a little bit of time and energy to paint. So I figured this would be a good time to make a video on what I'm doing right now. I wanted to do something kind of big to get myself back into the swing of painting. At the moment, I still have my Dark Angels. They're ongoing, they're all half painted, but that's turning into kind of a never-ending battle kind of project. I do intend to go back to them. I do want to finish that and get it ready for Armies on Parade eventually, but for now, I just want to get something impressive and fun and big done. So right around the time I started to have actual free time to do mini painting again, Games Workshop came along and released the Exodite box set. I haven't posted any of them on YouTube, but one of the first big things I did when I got into Warhammer was paint up a bunch of Eldar. I love Eldar. I've always been a huge Eldari fan. I really love painting the organic shapes and having more round surfaces and varied surfaces to work with than you normally get on Space Marines. And what is better to get me back into the hobby than taking those elves that I already love and sticking them on top of dinosaurs? So here we are. I'm doing a big kill team project. My hope is to eventually have this done for some kind of competition. I don't live anywhere close to a Golden Demon event, so most likely this will end up being something like Miniature Painting Open. I was able to walk away with 2 commended entries in MPO last year, so hopefully this one can actually get an award. But with all of that being said, what the hell am I actually doing? Well, I decided to make a giant display board diorama featuring this kill team. I have pretty lofty goals for this. Being a display board, I need to have all of the models remain removable and to keep the base sizes relatively intact. I also really wanted to capture the feel of a maiden world, and when I picture an untouched new world for the Eldari, the first thing that comes to mind is water. That's not because the Eldar are particularly aquatic. We're not doing an Idenith display. Something about having water features like a river and a waterfall really evokes pristine nature to me. I grew up in California. I spent a lot of time hiking, going out into the woods, and while the city I lived in was pretty dry, going out into the mountains and walking into the forest, finding little streams, creeks, rivers, and waterfalls really took me to a different place. So in my mind, when I envision pristine nature, water is definitely a big part of it. So that's what I set out to do. I want to make a display board that prominently features water effects, and also has the minis remaining completely removable, and is also painted to a competition level. As I'm recording this, I'm starting to feel how deep into the shit I really am. But that's okay. This is a learning process for me. This is a project that I will never get done unless I teach myself to paint a little bit every day. That's something I've been really bad at recently. I am really good at painting 6 to 7 hour blocks at a time. I'll get really into it, hyper focus on it, paint something really cool, and then lose all motivation and not paint for 2 or 3 weeks. I need to break that habit. Having a kid, having a busier life, means that I don't have long periods of time to get painting done. If I want to be able to continue in this hobby, I need to teach myself to do a little bit every day. Even if that's only 10 or 15 minutes, I need to sit down and do it. So with all that rambling out of the way, let me show you a little bit about the build. Painting has not even begun yet. I still have no idea how I'm going to tackle painting this thing. It's huge, there's a lot of space, a lot of details, but that's okay. That's future me's problem. For now, it's built, and I know how to paint the minis, so that's what I'm going to do first. Apologies in advance for the nature of this video. It's mostly just going to be me talking. I have some still images that I'll put up from time to time, but I really did not record any video of this process. So the first thing I had to do was figure out what I'm planning on doing for the base itself. I had a lot of options for this. I have some sheets of MDF that I could have used. I could go to the hardware store and pick up something like a shelf. In the end, I decided to go with a piece of XPS foam that I had lying around. I had a couple of reasons for this. Mostly the foam gives me clean edges that I can work with later to make it look more presentable, but at the same time I knew that water effects and a river were going to be a big part of the diorama, and by using XPS foam it gave me something that I could easily cut into to have the river sunk into the display a little bit. So on the screen now are two of the pictures that I kind of used as references for this. A lot of this is coming from my own experiences and memories as well, but if you take a look at these pictures, you'll see that the river I'm going for is pretty rocky. It's shallow, moving water, and the rocks are very visible. Because of that depth, I don't really need effects without getting into a lot of difficult resin work. Going with that rocky look, I also wanted to have the waterfall be something similar. So instead of going for a big dramatic waterfall, I'm instead having kind of a little cliff or overhang where the water is more dribbling down a series of rocks. So the first step was to get this laid out. I took the bases for the models and roughly put them onto the board where I thought they would be visually pleasing. Then using a big craft knife, I just started cutting out the board to make the river shape. After that, I used some cork board to build up the left side where the waterfall is going to be. And then, on the right side, I took some of that foam that I cut out with a craft knife and I glued it back onto the surface upside down. My idea for doing this was that after everything gets covered in ground texture, having subtle variations in the actual height of the display would bring a lot of interest to the final product, even if it's just subtle millimeter raises and dips. Now that the model's primed, I do think it comes through pretty well, and honestly, it was just a couple of minutes of gluing pieces on kind of at random, so it didn't really cost me anything to do it either. So from here came the next step. This is where I started to get a bit nervous. I needed to make sure that the models could socket into the display board and have a smooth fit so that their bases did not stand off from the board itself. Having the bases vanish into the display board when the minis were placed on it is really important to me for this project. So the first step on my way to achieving this was to just draw a circle around the base on the board and then use a mix of a screwdriver to poke the holes in and then extra thin plastic cement to sort of melt the foam around the base to give it a really nice indent. For the cork board, I couldn't melt that, so I just used the screwdriver to chip away at it until I got a clean finish. It's worth noting, when I used the extra thin cement, the base was not on the board. I basically made the holes and then used the cement to deepen them and widen them. And after that, you can see I have a fairly decent fit here. They're not flush with the foam itself, but that's okay. I knew there were going to be layers and layers of texture paint and dirt and other things on top of this, so having them standing out a bit from the actual foam itself didn't matter. You can also see here that I've added a little bit of an Exodite terrain detail. Looking at the different materials they included in the Exodite book, I decided to make this little triangle thing. For this one, I actually sculpted it out of paper clay, which is a very cheap air-drying polymer clay. It's not very strong or particularly rigid when it's dry, but it did take a layer of Tamiya plastic putty pretty well, and so after it was done, I covered it in plastic putty, sanded it down, covered it again in liquid green stuff, sanded it down again, and I think the end result is pretty good. Once the slots for the bases were cut into the display board, it was time to finally start adding some texture. Because this foam does not react well to a lot of solvents and glues, I wanted to make sure it was very well sealed. So the first step was to cover everything in a fairly thick layer of Tamiya texture paste. This is basically just PVA glue paint with some resin particles mixed into it, and it'll dry fairly hard and give you a decent texture. This was not intended to be the final texture in any way. It's mostly there to serve as a layer of protection, but it also provides the benefit of if there are any spaces later on that didn't get hit with texturing, they won't be bare foam. They will have some level of visual interest to them, and they will look like a ground effect or a dirt. And after many, many hours of drying, here we are. This is just something to bring a little bit of theming to the display board, so it doesn't need to be a perfect piece of terrain. And now came the fun part, to start making the waterfall and the river. To do this, I needed rocks, and I needed a lot of rocks. Luckily, the dollar stores around me sell tons of different aquarium products. So I went to 1 or 2 different dollar stores and picked out as many interesting, cheap bags of rocks that I could find. I have some sharp rocks, some round rocks, some big rocks, some small rocks, and some tree bark. Once it's painted and primed up, that tree bark will also look like a rock. So I started slowly layering in the big rocks first, then gradually working my way smaller and smaller on the waterfall part of the board. My idea when I was doing this was to try to envision the path the water would take. I want some big rocks acting as a dam, and then smaller rocks in the area where the water will flow over them. And you can see what that looks like here. When I was working on this board, I usually did everything on the board first, then went back in over the base. The reason for this is that if I did the base and board at the same time, I was worried that things would get stuck together or I would lose the ability to remove the base itself. So by doing the board first, I made sure that any details and rocks that were placed onto the model's base would be on top of the terrain that's on the display board. And because they're on top, that means I could always pull them up vertically to remove the model. In reality, this was a lot of back and forth. Put a layer of rocks onto the board, put the base down, see how I can get it to fit, put some more rocks onto the base, go back to the board, try to cover up the gap a little bit more, go back to the model. It was fidgety, and because I was working with PVA glue, this took quite some time. I think I went through 2 bottles of PVA for this project. It's cheap, so it didn't matter, but you could definitely feel the dry time. Once the waterfall section was done, I moved on to the river. The river was honestly the easiest thing for me to make in this whole project. I've done similar rocky river bases before for some of my Eldar, like this little ranger dude, and so I had a general idea for the effect I was going for. Here again, it was just a matter of laying down the big rocks put in place. I would always go back in with a mix of water, PVA glue, and alcohol, and drip that over the top of the rocks themselves. I was very careful not to brush it on. I wanted it to be poured over in drops, kind of like you would do with a resin pour. And as that dried, it really formed a tight seal between everything and made sure that the rocks aren't going anywhere. And here you can see the waterfall and the river are done. Well, that was the easy part. The next part is the forest. I spent a long time just kind of staring at this, trying to figure out how to get this to read like a forest floor. I decided that I need to work in maybe 3 or 4 different layers to achieve that. Layer 1 was taking my screwdriver and X-Acto knife again and cutting holes into the board itself to sink some rocks in. I didn't want them just covered in texture paste. I wanted to have a decent portion of a large rock actually sunk into the board for that effect. I also decided to try making a tree. I've made trees before. I've glued sticks together and tried to do things out of wire. This is the first time I really went full on with it. You can see here I'm working with several different sticks that have been glued together. Then I used smaller branches from a bush on top of that to give the effect of more branches. And then after that, I used something like seafoam, I think is the common product, to add the final tiny little details to it. At that point, it was good enough to prime. Once everything is fully painted, I plan to go in, add some moss, and then final leaf flocking to the tree to make it really have some volume. But for now, this is fine. So after the rocks were done, and the tree was sculpted and primed, I needed to go in and finally add the tree's detailing with green stuff. So these are things like the roots of the tree, which I sculpted in, and then over the roots in the tree itself, I used some Tamiya plastic putty to basically cut in a bark texture using my craft knife. I also took some of the little stick things, the seafoam, that I used for the tree and sunk them into the ground to make some bushes, I guess you'd call that a bush, some little different plant type objects. And then it was finally time to add the next layer of texture. I got some soil from the dollar store, just cheap soil meant for houseplants, and I mixed that with the same PVA glue I did for the rocks in the river, and did the same step of apply a layer of PVA glue to the board, sprinkle on the dirt, then on top of that dirt, drip on a mix of PVA water and alcohol. And I just let that dry, and then I had a very nice surface to add more detail to. So on top of this detailing, I added things like some sticks, maybe a few more rocks here and there, fallen logs, a skull, and then came the last layer, which were fallen leaves. So once again, back to the PVA method, did the exact same thing, and this time just sprinkled over some leaf litter from Green Stuff World, and then it was pretty much done. So from here, I do plan to add in a little bit of grass tufts and stuff like that once it's finally done. But it was pretty much ready to prime, and here we are. I have 2 layers of primer here, one black and then a spraying of white on top of it, just to give myself a bit of an idea of volumes and to make getting some gradients a little bit easier. And that's it. That's my current Kill Team diorama build. I didn't think I'd be talking for 15 minutes here, but here we are. This was quite a lot of work, but also quite a lot of fun. I really enjoyed getting to this part. With the Exodites on top of it, I think it looks really, really cool at the moment. The bases are all still easily removable. I went around the edges of all the bases with a thick layer of PVA glue too, just to make sure that as I pull them in and out of the diorama itself, nothing gets chipped off or broken. So they're rock hard now. They slide in super well. I think I've done a very good job of masking the seams. And now all that's left is to, well, paint the miniatures. Oh, and the giant stress-inducing water effects. Hopefully I'll have either a talking piece or a full video about how I plan to do those water effects. It's a big experiment for me. I think I have a rough workflow worked out, but I don't know how that's going to actually work when resin effects hit the model, so we'll see. At this point, I'm confident in my ability to not fail at this project. The resin might not look as good as I want it to when it's done, but I'm certainly not going to ruin the model with it. So, for anyone who watched or listened all the way to the end, thank you. I hope you got something out of this. It was good for me to sort of get my thoughts out and go through how I did this. It let me reflect on my build process and some mistakes and successes I had along the way. Hopefully I'll be bringing more of this diorama in the future, and I'm also working on a couple of other videos, so we'll see how that goes. Thank you for listening, and again, this has been Trismegistus Minis.